In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea the son of Elah began to reign in Samaria over Israel, and he reigned 9 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. So here we are. He is subject to the king of Assyria, and he's paying him money, kind of protection money. But, verse 4, the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it. So Hoshea thought he would outsmart Shalmaneser by kind of doing an end around and trying to develop an alliance with the king of Egypt and quit paying this tribute money to Assyria. He obviously didn't get the result he wanted. And we see that in verse 6, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria, placed them in Hala and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the city of the Medes. What a monumental statement in a single verse, right? Here's the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. Just one little verse, bam, story over. And then the writer is going to lay out what's happened and why in this next section. And here is verse 7. This to me is one of the key verses of especially this chapter, because it really lays out why this happened. This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods. So one of the things, I don't want to get too in the weeds on this because we don't have time, but in Exodus, part of the reason why God wanted to deliver Israel was they had drifted into worship of Egyptian gods and had forgotten about Yahweh. And he really wanted to show himself for who he was, both to Pharaoh and to the Israelites when he called them out. So verse 7 through 12, we see this. I'm not going to read all this right now, but we see that it reminds us that God brought the Israelites up out of slavery in Egypt, but they rejected the Lord and walked in the customs of the nations God drove out ahead of them. And I'm going to read verses 11 and 12, which kind of summarize that. There they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did whom the Lord carried away before them. And they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. And they served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this. So here God brings them out of Egypt, and he's cleared the land out ahead of them. And here the Israelites worship the gods that were in the land and rejected what God had done. And in spite of this, I'm going to read verse 13. In spite of this, God still wants to be merciful to Israel, and he warns them of the consequences of the path they were on. So verse 13, yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers and that I sent to you by my servants the prophets. And so what was Israel's response to this gracious warning of the Lord? Verse 14, they would not listen, but were stubborn as their fathers had been. And the next 3 or 4 verses talk about how Israel just rejects the warning of the Lord over and over and over again until we get to verse 18. And this sadly is how God ends up responding to Israel, finally removing them from the promised land. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. And the next 4 or 5 verses up through verse 23 just explain a little bit more and a little bit more about what's going on here and how God has finally said, okay, enough is enough. In verse 23, The Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had spoken by all his servants the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. And wherever it references this day is when the authors of this wrote the book of the Kings, which probably was during the exile. Dale Ralph Davis had a great quote in his commentary on this. He says, amazing grace is met with massive apostasy. We must never forget that at its root, Israel's love affair with the nations is a rejection of grace. Amazing grace should have been met with lasting gratitude, which is a yikes moment, and pause for reflection, right, for all of us. So the rest of chapter 17, 24 through 41, is an account of how Assyria resettles Samaria. Verses 24 through 28 describe this resettlement. None of the immigrants knew the Lord. Verse 25 says, at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. I'm going to read through verse 28. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So the king of Assyria was told, the nations that you've carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land, the little g God of the land. That's how they are interpreting Yahweh. Therefore he has sent lions among them, and behold, they are killing them, because they do not know the law of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded, send there one of the prophets whom you carried away from there, and let him go and dwell there and teach them the law of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they'd carried away from Samaria came and lived in Bethel and taught them how they should fear the Lord. So the king of Assyria sends back a priest from exile to teach these immigrants how to fear Yahweh. And let's just talk, I'm not going to read necessarily, but verses 29 through 34. Well, I'll just read a little bit of 29 because that explains what the next little section is about. But every nation still made gods of its own. Isn't that interesting? Even though there's going to be a little bit of irony here in the next few verses, but even though there was a priest explaining who God was, these immigrants still, depending on where they were from, they each made their own little God. So each group makes their own God. They worships them. And verses 32 and 33 also say they quote unquote fear the Lord, but several commentators said that's really meant to be ironic because they were still worshiping gods that they had handcrafted. And it bears asking the question, isn't that what our culture does today? You know, we're in a way encouraged in a very pagan practice of making our own deity, except it's kind of even gone a step further because there's the added twist of we're kind of deifying ourselves, making our own identity. That's what we're encouraged in these days. We're choosing to create our own identity and autonomy. And Dale Ralph also said this in his commentary, this is in the slide. He says, pagan religion creates what it likes. Biblical faith receives what is revealed. And I thought that was good. Pagan religion creates what it likes. In other words, I'm going to create a God that's going to serve me and make me happy, tell me everything I'm doing is okay. Biblical faith, in opposition to that, in contrast, receives what is revealed. So I'm going to read verses 35 through 40. We've heard this phrase several times already, and it's stated at least 11 times in verses 24 through 41. Fear the Lord. So I'm going to read verses 35 through 40. Actually, I'm going to start at 33. So they feared the Lord, but also served their own gods, after the manner of the nations from among whom they'd been carried away. To this day they do according to the former manner. They do not fear the Lord, and they do not follow the statutes or the rules of the law or the commandment the Lord commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. The Lord made a covenant with them and commanded them, you shall not fear other gods or bow yourselves to them or serve them or sacrifice to them, but you shall fear the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt with great power and with an outstretched arm. You shall bow yourselves to him, and to him you shall sacrifice. And the statutes and the rules and the law and the commandment that he wrote for you, you shall always be careful to do. You shall not fear other gods, and you shall not forget the covenant that I've made with you. You shall not fear other gods, but you shall fear the Lord your God, and he will deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies. And of course, we know that Israel's response, they would not listen, but they did according to their former manner. So these nations feared the Lord and also served their carved images. Their children did likewise, and their children's children, as their fathers did, so to this day. So this phrase, the fear of the Lord, that we've heard over and over, either they did fear the Lord or they didn't fear the Lord, comes from the Hebrew word Yahweh. Here, let me... Yahweh, Y-A-R-E, Yahweh, which means to fear, to revere, to hold in reverence. So we look at the phrase, do not fear, right, as don't be afraid and trust in the Lord, which is appropriate. But there's a second meaning here when we see do not fear these other gods, meaning don't give place to, don't worship these other gods, don't give reverence to and awe to that which is not real. And that kind of comes back to the first commandment. You know, I am the Lord. So I just thought that was interesting. Over and over and over again in chapter 17, we see that phrase, fear the Lord or don't fear the Lord. And there's an intent on God's part to communicate to the Israelites, I'm the one you should fear and hold in reverence and awe because I'm actually the only real God. Okay, well, so let's move on to chapter 18. And here's a layout of chapter 18. We get to meet Hezekiah now, and he's one of the most righteous kings since King David. And I'm going to read the first 8 verses of this. In the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. He removed the high places and broke the pillars and cut down the Asherah, and he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, which is so interesting that even that they had made an idol of, which we're prone to do, right? We take created things and good things of the Lord and make idols of them and worship them instead of worshiping God. For until those days, the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called Nushtan. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses. And the Lord, this is huge, this verse right here, verse 7, and the Lord was with him. That's not said of any other kings except for David. Wherever he went out, he prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. He struck down the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory, from watchtower to fortified city. So the next few verses 9 through 12, they're a retelling of the fall of Israel. And some commentators say that that's in there to kind of contrast Hezekiah's bravery and how he stood against Assyria, where it says here, he rebelled against the king of Assyria, would not serve him. To contrast his bravery, they're retelling in a few verses how Assyria attacked and took over Israel and carried them away to exile. Well, so then moving on to verses 13 through 16, we have a new ruler in Assyria now, Sennacherib. And he's replaced Shalmaneser, and they brings a new situation here. Sennacherib's replaced Shalmaneser, and he now attacks Judah, and we read in there, he takes a bunch of their cities. And even though Hezekiah was righteous, even though he was brave, even though he had stood against Assyria, and even though we read that the Lord was with him, Sennacherib has success capturing a bunch of the cities of Judah, and Hezekiah caves in, politically speaking. He pays tribute to Assyria, ransacking even the temple to find tribute money and gold to pay Assyria. And it just is interesting. Faith doesn't protect us from all disasters, and yet God's faithful even when circumstances go against us. But it's a reminder that God is not a lucky charm or a rabbit's foot, right? So Hezekiah caves into Sennacherib's demands and pays him tribute, but I think at some point he quit paying him tribute. In verses 17 through 35, there are these three representatives of Sennacherib that come to meet with Hezekiah. And what we read is that Hezekiah refuses to meet with him, but he instead sends out his own three representatives. And so there's a little bit of dialogue between the representatives of Assyria and the representatives of Hezekiah. And one of them, the Rabshakeh, is they're asking in verse 19, he says, "On what do you rest this trust of yours?" And that's a very important theme here. Do you think that mere words are strategy and power for war? And whom do you now trust that you have rebelled against me? And then moving on, I'm going to read verses 28 and 30. So trust was a key word. Deliver is now a key word. Verse 28, then the Rabshakeh stood and called out in a loud voice in the language of Judah, "Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you out of my hand. Do not let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord by saying, the Lord will surely deliver us, and this city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria." So it's interesting. He was using the word trust to try and manipulate and coerce Hezekiah into succumbing again. He used the word trust, then he uses the word deliver, but they go a little bit too far. I'm going to read verse 35. He says, "Who among all the gods of the lands have delivered their lands out of my hand, that the Lord," meaning Yahweh, "should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand?" And he's gone a little bit far here because he's now comparing, and this is where I think the Assyrians really don't get the fundamental difference. He's comparing Yahweh to all of these other little g gods. And he's kind of stepped over the line at that point. Hezekiah's response and then all of Judah's response, I'm going to read the last three verses. Here he is, these guys have been railing against the Israelites, the Judeans, and their response now, verse 36, the people were silent, and they answered him not a word, for the king's command was to not answer him. Then Eliakim the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna the secretary, and Joah the son of Asaph, the recorder, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn and told him the words of the Rabshakeh. So that's Judah's response to the Assyrians. And this is where we're going to stop today. You have to tune in next week for the next installment. It's just such an interesting chapter, isn't it? That here was Hezekiah, this strong, godly, righteous king. The Lord was with him. Well, then he kind of caves into Sennacherib. Then he rebels against him. Sennacherib sends these representatives to try and coerce them back into compliance, and kind of goes overboard far enough to where their response is they don't answer him and they don't give in to his wanting them to to give in. But that's where we're stopping for the day. And a couple of things have stood out to me in these two chapters. And I know we talk about this frequently, but God is faithful to his covenant promises because he is faithful and he is true. His word is true. Leviticus chapter 26, there's several places in Leviticus and Deuteronomy where there's two ways of living laid out from the Lord. Choose life or choose death. Obey me or disobey. And you're going to have results and consequences to either one. Leviticus chapter 26 is a great chapter to read to describe God's covenant promises both for obedience and disobedience. And here is to apply especially to chapter 17, Leviticus 26:33. And I will scatter you among the nations, and I will unsheathe the sword after you, and your land shall be a desolation, and your cities shall be a waste. Which is hard. Those are hard words, but that's exactly what happened here, isn't it? We saw the result of hundreds of years of Israel being unfaithful to the Lord and following their kings who were leading them down this path of disobedience and worshiping other gods. And here's the result, Israel being carried away. And then what else have we seen? In chapter 18, we've seen the beginning of the story of the good King Hezekiah and how God is faithful, but not everything turns out perfectly for him. And we're left with questions. Why do bad things sometimes happen to good people? And why did the king of Assyria still have some success against Judah, even though they had a righteous king and he was leading them in the ways of the Lord? Hard chapters, hard questions, events that are not easily explainable. And I'm in hopes that this helps us hang on in our own lives when things don't go the way we want them to. And I think one thing this does is ultimately points to Christ and his sufferings on our behalf, because you can't look at the cross and you can't look at the end of Jesus' earthly life knowing that it was his choice and it was the way God ordained it. But you can't look at the cross and say that things are always going to be easy for a Christian. And Tim Keller, I found this quote, and it's not a zingy, happy quote, but gosh, it's so good. Any person who sticks with Christianity as long as things are going his or her way is a stranger to the cross. And gosh, it's kind of a yikes quote, and yet I think it's the truth. Even though we know the end of the story is good, and that new heavens and the new earth, we talked about this last week in 2 Peter chapter 3, the end of the story is so good, and yet between here and there is suffering that we will endure. And I'd like to close before we get to our discussion questions, this Spurgeon quote, which I think is the answer to why do bad things happen to good people. Well, it says, when you go through a trial, the sovereignty of God is the pillow upon which you lay your head. We know God's good. We know he's faithful. We know he's true. We know he's sovereign. And I believe that's what we lay our head on.